You spend 6 months compiling a policy report. You run the regressions, check the footnotes, and slide a 300-page binder across the decision-maker's desk. And nothing happens. It sits on red. There is a frustrating reality in public policy work. Perfect logic and rigorous data are entirely insufficient to drive political action. Decision-makers and the public do not process raw facts in a vacuum. They filter every piece of information through innate cognitive biases and pre-existing moral frameworks before accepting a single data point as true. To survive these human filters, communicators have to engineer their messages. They built their arguments using a 4-layer architecture known as the persuasion stack. This stack consists of structural formats, moral framing, narrative arcs, and the visual interface. Mastering these 4 layers separates analysts who passively transmit data from practitioners who actively engineer policy reform. The foundation of this stack is the telling method. This is a format defined by the direct, concise transmission of facts, intentionally stripped of emotional appeal. The primary tool for this method is the policy memo, an instrument built specifically for busy internal stakeholders who already recognize that a problem exists. Look at this standard policy memo template. The effectiveness of the telling method relies on this rigid sequence of headers: executive summary, background, key findings, recommendations, and conclusion. The most critical section, the key findings, demands a specific logical progression. First, you identify the exact status of the problem. Second, you establish the specific criteria that explain why action is necessary right now. Third, you propose a concrete recommendation that addresses the problem. Finally, you evaluate the future trade-offs and unintended consequences of that recommendation. The telling method organizes logic efficiently. But if your audience is skeptical or uninvested in the issue, this format lacks the emotional resonance required to make them care. That requires the next layer. This brings us to moral framing. Factual arguments often fail because they ignore the psychological systems that form human ethical beliefs. Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt developed the moral foundations theory, which identifies the universal, innate psychological systems that influence how people perceive right and wrong. The theory outlines 6 distinct foundations: care and harm, fairness and cheating, loyalty and betrayal, authority and subversion, sanctity and degradation, and liberty and oppression. Audiences segment politically across these lines. Research shows liberal audiences heavily prioritize the care and harm foundation. Conservative audiences distribute their focus more evenly, balancing care with authority, loyalty, and sanctity. You can use this segmentation to frame the exact same policy for different audiences. Take the regulation of artificial intelligence in law enforcement. When writing for a liberal audience, you anchor the argument in the care and harm foundation. You present the data by emphasizing how unregulated algorithmic facial recognition causes tangible harm to marginalized communities, focusing on unjust outcomes. When presenting the same policy to a conservative audience, you anchor it in the liberty and oppression foundation. You reframe the exact same data to highlight the threat of unchecked government surveillance and the infringement on personal autonomy. Matching your policy argument to your audience's dominant moral foundation bypasses their cognitive defenses. It allows them to process the data without feeling intellectually attacked. Sometimes mapping morality isn't enough.
When an audience needs to actually feel the stakes of a policy, you move to the 3rd layer, the showing method. This approach relies on narrative storytelling. Cognitive science shows that narratives trigger emotional shifts and neurochemical releases that make facts highly persuasive. This chart shows Aristotle's dramatic arc. It plots the emotional tension of a story over time, providing a highly effective structure for policy reform narratives. A policy narrative begins with an opening scene to set the stage, followed by progressive complications. In a piece on Colorado's housing crisis, this rising action outlines the severe shortage of homes, escalating costs, and the strict local zoning laws blocking new development. The tension builds to the crisis, a forced decision point for lawmakers. This is immediately followed by the climax, showing the real-world unfolding consequences of whether they chose to act or retreat. The arc finishes with the resolution. Instead of abstract conclusions, this is where the concrete policy recommendation is presented as the necessary closure to the conflict established in the opening scene. Applying this narrative structure transforms dry, data-driven content into an emotional journey. It organizes complex information in the exact format the human brain evolved to process. The final layer translates your structured, morally framed narrative into a live presentation, the visual interface. Before designing a single slide, you have to map the presentation to your audience's needs. This determines exactly what data supports your argument and what data needs to be cut. An audience needs map answers 3 questions. What do they already know? What concepts might they resist? And what specific new understanding is required to take action? Once you know what data to show, you execute the design by thinking in visual layers. An effective chart has 3 layers. First is the background, providing the axes and scale. Second is the data, the raw information like bars or lines. Third is the emphasis, the specific focal point that forces the audience to look exactly where you want them to. Selecting the right chart typology depends entirely on the interrogative question your data answers. This table shows that if you are answering a what question, like what quantities changed over time, you use bar charts, stacked bars, or line graphs. Effective slide is never about decoration. It is the practice of ruthlessly eliminating non-essential visual noise to expose the core policy insight. These 4 distinct layers do not just operate independently, they form a single, cohesive, and powerful workflow for policy persuasion. First, select your baseline format, deciding between the direct telling method or the narrative showing method. Then you map your logical argument to the target audience's dominant moral foundation. Next, you structure the delivery, using either a strict memo template or an Aristotelian arc. Finally, you design a visual interface that highlights the primary data and removes the friction of understanding. Skipping any one of these crucial layers entirely breaks the communication chain. The underlying logic completely gets lost in translation. The audience feels alienated, and you end up right back where we started, with a massive, unread report sitting on a disk. Policy communication is not an academic exercise designed to prove how much research an analyst completed. It is about engineering a cognitive and emotional bridge. When you align your structure, psychology, narrative, and visuals, decision makers are both equipped with the facts and motivated to act on them.